Was it murder, a freak accident, or a witchcraft ritual? All three have been suggested as the reason behind the death of William II of England, and in today's video from History Calling, I'm going to take you back to the medieval sources to try to get to the bottom of this royal mystery and figure out why William's own brother might have wanted him dead. We'll also be looking at what happened to his body, including why some thought it was suffering divine punishment, and why there is a second mystery about where his bones actually lie now. William II was born in around 1060, the son of William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders. At the time of his death, which occurred in 1100, he had a surviving older brother named Robert Curthose and a younger brother named Henry. He was called William Rufus, meaning William the Red, because of his ruddy complexion, not his hair colour, which was blonde according to the near-contemporary chronicler William of Malmesbury. This isn't a biography video, so I'm not going to go through his life in detail, but there are some things you need to know. First, why was William King of England if he had an older brother? Well, that was because the idea of the firstborn legitimate son getting everything upon the father's death wasn't yet set in stone in this time period. Even legitimacy wasn't a must-have, as the story of the illegitimate William the Conqueror shows. And also, it's because William the Conqueror and William Rufus didn't get along very well with Robert. Furthermore, when the Conqueror died, Rufus effectively nabbed the English throne. He seized the treasury and had himself crowned before Robert could stop him. Unlike in later centuries, coronations were extremely important in this era, and not the purely ceremonial events they would later become. Robert, meanwhile, was left in control of the Conqueror's French territories in Normandy and Man, and while he certainly believed he should have had England too, he was never able to take it, despite some attempts to do so. The next thing to know is that William Rufus never married. There were rumours he was gay, though he had no known male favourites either, and he had no children, legitimate or otherwise, to inherit. His heir could therefore be seen as either one of his brothers. However, in practice, at the time of his death, Robert was off crusading in the Holy Lands. Actually, to be specific, he was on his way back from there, and this left Prince Henry as the natural, obvious candidate to take the throne next, and gave him a motive to want William Rufus dead. Finally, by 1100, he wasn't a popular king in some quarters. Although he started out well, buying support for his slightly shaky claim to the throne by throwing lots of money at the church and the English barons, once he was ensconced, he became pretty annoying to a lot of people. Numerous laws were enacted that drained both the aristocracy and the church of money, including heavy inheritance taxes, taxes for barons to marry off a female relative, the practice of the crown taking wardship of deceased barons' underage children rather than giving it to a family member, and William's love of keeping abbeys vacant so that he could pocket the money they generated for himself. So now we come to the sequence of events leading up to the king's demise. We have no completely contemporary source for this, so nothing written by someone who was there and composed in the immediate aftermath of events, but we do have several near-contemporary ones. The closest chronologically would be the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by various ecclesiastical writers living in England, and the Historia Novorum in Anglia, also written by a very well-placed and very well-connected English churchman whose name was Edmure. He was born in around 1060, lived and worked at Canterbury Cathedral, knew William's Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, and started his book in the 1090s. After these most immediate sources, there's the Chronicle of William of Malmesbury, which was started before 1118 and finished by about 1125. Then there's Orderic Vitalis, an English-born monk living in France who wrote the book The Ecclesiastical History of England and Normandy, starting in the 1110s and finishing with Orderic's death in 1142. Malmesbury and Orderic are therefore weakened by the fact that they were writing years, even decades, after the events they were describing. Plus, Orderic wasn't in England. But, on the other hand, they were both writing within living memory of William's death and would have had access to a network of informants to get them good information. The fact that, as we'll see, these 4 sources all pretty much sing from the same hymn sheet lends credibility to them. I will be mentioning a few other sources as we go along, but these are the big 4. As William's death approached, there were supposedly some ominous portents that something was going to happen to him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives us a hint about one of them and immediately connects it to the monarch's demise soon afterwards, saying, "At Pentecost, the 20th of May, was seen in Berkshire at a certain town blood to well from the earth, as many said that should see it. And thereafter, on the morning after Lammas Day, 2nd of August 1100, was the King William shot in hunting by an arrow from his own men." Edmer gives us a little more detail about the death, but none about the portents, writing, "The 2nd day of the following August saw him dying. On that day, after having breakfasted, he went out into the forest to hunt, and there, struck by an arrow that pierced his heart, impenitent and unconfessed, he died instantly, and was at once forsaken by everyone. Whether, as some say, that arrow struck him in its flight, or, as the majority declare, he stumbled and, falling violently upon it, met his death, is a question we think it unnecessary to go into. Sufficient to know that by the just judgment of God he was stricken down and slain." Note Edmer's hostility to William here and his feeling that the death was deserved. It's a theme we'll be coming back to. These are fairly basic accounts of William's death compared to the others I'll be sharing with you. But I'd like you to note that at this early stage there is no mention of who shot him, and in fact Edmer wasn't even sure he had been shot. There were stories going around, believed by the majority of people according to him, that William simply fell on an arrow that he was presumably carrying. This lack of a named shooter puts the Chronicle and Edmer at odds with most other accounts, but remember, those other accounts were written later, so perhaps their authors had more information available to them, or perhaps they were starting to embellish the tale. William of Malmesbury picks up the story on the 1st of August, and like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he writes of some strange goings-on that seem to suggest that the king was in danger, saying, "The day before the king died, he dreamed that he was let blood by a surgeon, and that the stream, reaching to heaven, clouded the light and intercepted the day. Calling on St. Mary for protection, he suddenly awoke, commanded a light to be brought, and forbade his attendants to leave him. They then watched with him several hours until daylight. Shortly after, just as the day began to dawn, a certain foreign monk told Robert Fitzhamon, one of the principal nobility, that he had that night dreamed a strange and fearful dream about the king, that he had come into a certain church with menacing and insolent gestures, as was his custom, looking contemptuously on the standers by, then violently seizing the crucifix, he gnawed the arms and almost tore away the legs, that the image endured this for a long time, but at length struck the king with its foot in such a manner that he fell backwards. From his mouth, as he lay prostrate, issued so copious a flame that the volumes of smoke touched the very stars. Robert, thinking that this dream ought not to be neglected, as he was intimate with him, immediately related it to the king. William, repeatedly laughing, exclaimed, "He is a monk, and dreams for money like a monk. Give him 100 shillings. Nevertheless, being greatly moved, he hesitated a long while whether he should go out to hunt, as he had designed, his friends persuading him not to suffer the truth of the dreams to be tried at his personal risk. In consequence, he abstained from the chase before dinner, dispelling the uneasiness of his unregulated mind by serious business. They relate that, having plentifully regaled the day, he soothed his cares with a more than usual quantity of wine. After dinner he went into the forest, attended by few persons, of whom the most intimate with him was Walter, surnamed Tirel, who had been induced to come from France by the liberality of the king. This man alone had remained with him, while the others, employed in the chase, were dispersed as chance directed. The sun was now declining, when the king, drawing his bow and letting fly an arrow, slightly wounded a stag which passed before him, and, keenly gazing, followed it, still running, a long time with his eyes, holding up his hand to keep off the power of the sun's rays. At this instant, Walter, conceiving a noble exploit, which was while the king's attention was otherwise occupied, to transfix another stag, which by chance came near him, unknowingly and without power to prevent it, O gracious God, pierced his breast with a fatal arrow. On receiving the wound, the king uttered not a word, but breaking off the shaft of the weapon where it projected from his body, fell upon the wound, by which he accelerated his death. Walter immediately ran up, but as he found him senseless and speechless, he leaped swiftly upon his horse and escaped by spurring him to his utmost speed. There are a few things to draw your attention to here. First, the king's own bad dream seems to foretell his manner of death with a stream of blood coming from him, while the monk's bad dream seems influenced by William's mistreatment of the church. Personally, I very much doubt that details like this are true. To me, they scream artistic license. Malmesbury, writing decades later, knew the king was going to die that day, and so he retroactively added in some ominous events just before the death to hammer home the idea that it was divine providence. Second, we get the name of the supposed killer here, Walter Tirel, who was the Count of Poix. Third, we're told that it was just the two of them when the fatal arrow was shot, and that the king didn't speak at all and was immediately tended to by Tirel, who, seeing there was nothing he could do, took off on his horse. If he truly was the only person there, then no one else could have been the source of these details, nor the information about William shielding his eyes from the setting sun. But as we'll see shortly, there's a problem with this version of events. Fourth, just as with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Edmur's work, there is no hint here that the king's death was anything but a tragic accident. Fifth, in this version, the king is both shot and he falls on the arrow. Edmure had obviously heard both stories too, but he thought it was one or the other, whereas Malmesbury says that both occurred. Finally, I'd just like to hammer it home once again that William wasn't popular with the clergy, and the people writing up these histories of his death were clergy. We therefore have to keep the bias of writers like Malmesbury in mind. You get a sense of his dislike for the king when he criticises William's menacing and insolent gestures, which he said was usual for William in a church, and later in his account he wrote that he was a man much to be pitied by the clergy, for throwing away a soul which they could not save, and he levels numerous criticisms at the monarch for his treatment of the church. We now move on to Orderic Vitalis, who also provides a lengthy description of events. He writes that, the morning of the day following, King William, having dined with his minions, prepared after the meal was ended to go forth and hunt in the New Forest. Being in great spirits, he was joking with his attendants while his boots were being laced, when an armourer came and presented to him 6 arrows. The king immediately took them with great satisfaction, praising the work, and unconscious of what was to happen, kept 4 of them himself and held out the other 2 to Walter Tirel. It is but right, he said, that the sharpest arrows should be given to him who knows best how to inflict mortal wounds with them. This Tirel was a French knight of good extraction, the wealthy lord of the castles of Poix and Pontoise, filling a high place among the nobles, and a gallant soldier. He was therefore admitted to familiar intimacy with the king, and became his constant companion. Meanwhile, while they were idly talking on various subjects, and the king's household attendants were assembled about him, a monk of Gloucester presented himself, and delivered to the king a letter from his abbot. Having read it, the king burst out laughing, and said merrily to the knight just mentioned, Walter, do what I told you. The knight replied, I will, my lord. Slighting then the warning of the elders, and forgetting that the heart is filled up before a fall, he said respecting the letter he had received, I wonder what has induced my lord Serlo to write to me in this strain, for I really believe he is a worthy abbot and respectable old man. In the simplicity of his heart, he transmits to me, who have enough besides to attend to, the dreams of his snoring monks, and even takes the trouble to commit them to writing and send them a long distance. Does he think that I follow the example of the English, who will defer their journey or their business on account of the dreams of a parcel of wheezing old women? Thus speaking, he hastily rose, and mounting his horse, rode at full speed to the forest. His brother, Count Henry, with William de Breteuil and other distinguished persons, followed him, and having penetrated into the woods, the hunters dispersed themselves in various directions according to custom. The king and Walter de Poix posted themselves with a few others in one part of the forest, and stood with their weapons in their hands, eagerly watching for the coming of the game, when a stag suddenly running between them, the king quitted his station and Walter shot an arrow. It grazed the beast's grisly back, but glancing from it, mortally wounded the king, who stood within its range. He immediately fell to the ground, and alas, suddenly expired. Okay, so we have a story which is very similar to that of Malmesbury here, and which doesn't really conflict with what is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or Edmer either. It's just more detailed than they are and takes a firmer line on how that arrow came to be in William's chest. We get some extra information about the king giving arrows to Walter Tyrrell earlier in the day, and again hear the story about the letter from a monk warning him of a prophetic dream about his own doom. Just as with Malmesbury, I'd be very suspicious about these fantastical details, as they only appeared decades after the events and sound a lot like later editions designed to produce a better story and provide a moral and religious bent to the tale by making the reader believe that the death was foretold by God. You'll note that Orderic also criticises Henry for not listening to the warnings of his elders, even when those warnings were just about dreams, which of course we wouldn't look at as prophecies nowadays, and apparently, if he was given such warnings, William didn't think much of them either, though of course in Malmesbury's version of events, the sovereign's own bad dream had given him pause for thought. Emma Mason, whose book on the death I'll link below for you, points out that the idea that William gave the weapon that felled him to the man who killed him is a theme which appears to have been copied from classical mythology, especially the story of Cephalus and Procris. The king's words to Tyrrell also seem to echo the last words of Christ to Judas Iscariot at the Last Supper. The cause of death and the accidental nature of it is repeated too, though in this case the arrow grazes the back of its intended target, a passing stag, before hitting the king. In this instance, though, Tyrrell is not alone with the king. There are a few others with them, which provides us with other sources from whom details of the king's final minutes could have come. Nevertheless, despite the possible presence of multiple witnesses, there is still a wrinkle in the theory that Tyrrell was the man holding the bow. Before I tell you what that is, if you're enjoying this content, please give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment below, as this helps it to float to the top on YouTube and get recommended to other people with similar interests. You can also subscribe to the channel with the notifications activated so you never miss an upload. And for bonuses and perks on the platform, you can join my YouTube membership by clicking the join button beneath videos and following the on-screen instructions. For those of you with Irish ancestry, you might also want to buy my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available as an ebook or paperback from Amazon and linked below for you. I have a website too, historycallingofficial.com, where you can join my free mailing list and get 2 complimentary downloads about how to spot good history versus bad and how to interview family members about your family's history. Again, it's linked below for you. This wrinkle comes to us courtesy of a man named Sugar. I swear that was his real name. He was the abbot of Saint-Denis, which is a cathedral in Paris. He lived between about 1081 and 1151, and he wrote a book called The Life of Louis the Fat. Again, I promise I'm not making this up. In it, he mentioned having spoken with Tyrrell on numerous occasions and stated that Tyrrell always firmly denied having killed the king or even being with him in the forest that day. Sugar argued that Tyrrell was to be believed because he was then in France and had no need to fear retribution for what had happened in England. However, I think we could just as easily make the argument that if you've killed a king, accident or not, then fled to France, which Tyrrell did right after the death, you're going to deny it as much as possible. I'll leave it up to you though. Do you think Tyrrell was the archer that day? Let me know in the comments below. There are other 12th century accounts of William Rufus's death. Henry of Huntingdon, a well-connected English archdeacon and historian who wrote the Historia Anglorum, first published in 1129, said in it that William ended his cruel life with a miserable end. for having held court with splendour and patriotic honour at Christmas at Gloucester, at Easter at Winchester, at Pentecost at London, he went hunting in the New Forest on the morrow of the calends of August, where Walter Tyrrell, aiming at a deer with an arrow, killed the king unawares. The king fell down, struck by the heart, and uttered not a word. Then there's the Chronicon ex Chronicus, once attributed to the monk Florence of Worcester, but now believed to have been written by another called John of Worcester, and which was completed by 1140. It said that the king, quote, was struck by a carelessly aimed arrow by a certain Franco, Walter, nicknamed Tirelus, and ended his life. With this writer too, King William was unpopular, for Worcester went on to comment, no wonder, as the rumour of the people affirms, that this is undoubtedly a great power of God, and has been vindicated. In other words, William's sudden death at the age of 40 was God's punishment on him for his wicked life. We also have a brief mention of the death in the later work of Ralph de Decetto, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, who was only born in about 1120 and so must therefore have been regurgitating other sources when he wrote in his chronicle that King William of the English, while he was hunting in the New Forest on the feast day of St. Peter in Chains, was struck by an arrow from Walter Tyrrell and died. There's also the writer Poix, that was his only name, born near the start of the 12th century, and who wrote a book called the Roman de Rue for Henry II of England, who came to the throne in 1154. Again, he was obviously using earlier sources when he gave an account which broadly matches those already cited, saying that the king, Tyrrell, and other archers, so Tyrrell wasn't alone with the king in this scenario, were in pursuit of some deer when Tyrrell supposedly shot the king. He is more cautious about apportioning blame though, writing, I do not know who shot or who refrained, nor who struck or who missed, but it is said, though I do not know if it is true, that Tyrrell shot and killed the king. Many say he stumbled, that he was hindered by his coat, that his arrow was deflected, and as he fell the king was struck. Some say that Tyrrell wanted to shoot at a stag that passed between him and the king at a run. He shot with clear aim, but the arrow glanced off, the arrow struck a tree, and the shaft passed through, hitting the king and bringing him down dead. And Gaunter, meaning Walter, Tyrrell quickly ran to where the king had fallen and lay. He also added in a supernatural element, saying that Prince Henry was warned that same day by an old peasant woman living in a cottage in the New Forest, and who said that she could see the future, that he would soon be king. Again, this smacks of later literary invention to me. Finally, we have the claim by Gerald of Wales, nearly a century after the king's death, that he was felled not by Tyrrell, but by a knight called Ranulph de Poix. Emma Mason wondered if this was a slight mistake. Tyrrell was known as being from Aquesne, near Pontoise in France, and perhaps that was transmuted into Poix, and the actual shooter was a tenant of Walter's called Ranulph, who was hired to fire the necessary arrow. This then would make Walter liable for the death without him actually having to carry it out, and might explain his insistence in later life that he hadn't been with the king at the time of William's demise. Or perhaps Gerald of Wales was just making up stories. Who knows? Despite the differences in the various renditions of the story, the main thing I take from all of them is that no one is suggesting that the king was murdered, and in fact the Chronicon ex Chronicus even points out that deaths due to hunting accidents were a common occurrence, saying, even earlier, the younger brother of the same William, Richard, another of the Conqueror's sons, had perished in the same forest a long time before, and a little before his brother Richard, the son of Robert, Count of the Normans, so the nephew of William Rufus, while he too had been hunting, was killed by an arrow from his soldier. Despite there being no hint of foul play in the original sources, and hunting accidents being an alarmingly common way to die in the Norman royal family, in later years, people have wondered if perhaps William II's death was part of a plot hatched by his brother Henry, who was also in the woods that day, so that he could take the throne before their brother Robert returned from crusading, and might have become William's heir. This idea seems to revolve around the fact that Henry got the throne, and that directly after his brother's death, He rode to Winchester post-haste, seized control of the treasury, then sped back to London and managed to get himself crowned king at Westminster Abbey on the 5th of August, at which point he released a coronation charter which must, according to this argument, have taken some premeditation to create and couldn't have been written up in the 4 days since William's death. He also supposedly showed great favour to the family of Walter Tyrrell during his reign. These family members' surnames were Clare and Gifford, with the Clares being Tyrrell's wife's family. And the French writer Geoffrey Gamer, who wrote his Histoire des Anglais, meaning History of the English, in the later 1130s, claimed that 2 of them were on the hunt the day that William died. In this theory, the supernatural warnings about dangers to his life, which may or may not have really occurred, were the result of rumours which may have been swirling about a plot. There is another way to look at this sequence of events, though. We can view Henry's actions as smart and entirely natural given the era in which he was living. These were the Middle Ages. If you wanted the throne, you had to act fast when the opportunity presented itself to get it, just as William himself had done, and just as Henry's nephew Stephen would do in 1135 after Henry himself died, and Stephen seized the crown before his cousin Matilda, Henry's daughter and acknowledged heiress, could get to England. If Henry hadn't done the same in 1100, what would have happened to the realm in the absence of anyone else immediately available to take over? And what would have happened to him for his loyalty to William over Robert? I have no trouble imagining that he'd at least thought about what he would do if anything happened to William, and knew that he'd need the treasury and a coronation. But that doesn't mean he planned his brother's murder, and despite all the other criticisms levelled at him over the years, it was a long time before the conspiracy theorists started to suggest he was guilty of fratricide. Furthermore, though he would later defeat and imprison Robert for decades until the latter's death, he didn't kill him. So if he was supposedly prepared to murder one brother, why not the other? In a 1973 article written by historian C. Warren Hollister, he also pointed out that Henry I's coronation charter was just a 14-point list that reversed some of William Rufus's most unpopular policies, and could certainly have been put together very quickly. As for the supposed favour Henry showed to Tyrrell's family, Hollister counters this by saying, quote, "There is nothing to suggest that prior to the shooting, Henry had any relationship whatever with the Clares, the Giffords, or Walter Tyrrell. Plus the idea that Gilbert and Roger of Clare were in the hunting party only appears in Gamer's much later, quote, rhyming, error-ridden work, which is hardly to be trusted and is flatly contradicted by other, better sources. The favour that the Clares did receive from Henry was nothing out of the ordinary for a family of their position, says Hollister, and if, as numerous sources suggest, Tyrrell didn't actually fire the arrow that killed William Rufus, then, quote, the Clare-Gifford hypothesis collapses at its base. Now let's look in a little more detail at Gamer's Histoire des Anglais. Composed like a poem, it is noteworthy because in parts it strays from the narrative provided elsewhere. Some of it matches other stories we've looked at though, for Gamer says that other knights were with the king and Tyrrell when the fatal shot was fired, and that we do not know who had loosed the bow. However, the other archers said that it had come from Walter's bow. It seemed so, for he fled at once. Now, of course, if Tyrrell felt he was being scapegoated by the other men there, that would certainly explain why he fled to France so quickly. It wouldn't necessarily be a sign of true guilt. Where Gamer really goes to town, though, is in his account of what happened next, for he gives a very detailed story about Henry's last minutes that doesn't appear anywhere else, writing, "The king fell and cried out 4 times, asking for the Corpus Domini, the Eucharist, but there was no one to give it to him, for he was far from any monastery, alone in a desolate place. Yet a hunter, gathering herbs and flowers, took a little and gave it to the king to eat, thinking he could still save him. In God is this, and so it must be. He had taken blessed bread on the Sunday before, he must be a good protector. Now it happened that the king was dead." This doesn't ring true to me at all. Numerous far better sources state that the king had been shot in the heart and dropped dead without a word. I don't think he would have lingered long enough to cry out and wait for herbs and flowers to be gathered up and then fed to him. Other parts of Gamer's work have the whiff of invention too. For a start, he goes on to say that all the lords were wringing their hands in grief at the death of a supposedly beloved king, and built him an elaborate funeral bier to transport the body, when all the evidence shows that everybody scattered and went home, and no one particularly liked William anyway. He also claims that the bishop who presided over an elaborate funeral, again, no other source speaks of such a funeral, was Bishop Walkelin, a man who'd actually died 2 years earlier. Gaymar's claims, where they diverge from the other sources, are highly dubious at best. Next we come to the witchcraft theory. This was invented in 1952 by Margaret Murray and very effectively dismantled by Hollister in 1973. According to this theory, William was a member of an old pagan religion which decreed that kings had to be sacrificed after a certain amount of time, and so he allowed himself to be killed. This is why he didn't like the church, why there were supernatural portents of doom before his death, and why Gaymar says the bier used to hold his body was covered in flowers, which is a detail associated with paganism. All the chroniclers, being part of the Christian church, also covered it up as part of a gigantic conspiracy which spanned centuries and encompassed both England and France. Now, as well as the fact that there's zero evidence to support this idea, that the notion of a huge conspiracy is completely impractical and moronic, and that Gaymar is a much later source with known errors and apparently invented details, Murray also conveniently ignored any evidence which directly refuted her crackpot conspiracy theory. For instance, the fact that in times of trouble, such as when he was very ill in 1093, William actually clung to the Christian church for support. Plus, he was actively making plans in 1100 for what he was going to do in the near future. Hardly the actions of a man about to let himself be killed in a ritual sacrifice. Murray also had to rely on sources describing supposed witchcraft activities from the 16th and 17th centuries because there's so little evidence for what was or wasn't going on 400 years earlier. But as Hollister correctly points out, quote, "The doctrines of witchcraft would doubtless have evolved considerably over 400 or 500 years, and it is hazardous to use such evidence to reconstruct unrecorded beliefs of the year 1100. Now, Murray, who had trained initially as a nurse before becoming interested in Egyptian archaeology, was actually well enough regarded in that field, but she later became interested in Wicca and folklore, and I think that's where the wheels really came off the wagon for her. Though she did work in academia, this was in the early decades of the 20th century, before modern concepts of academic rigour had really taken hold. Her PhD was an honorary one rather than being earned, and when she started publishing her theories about the history of witchcraft and old religions, her ideas took a lot of flack for being poorly researched and supported. She reminds me in that portion of her career of the pseudo-historians we suffer with in modern times. There are quite a few of them who like to make up stuff with regards to the later Plantagenets and the Tudors, and if you've been with me for a while, you'll know how low my opinion is of people like that. I pretty much think they are at best incompetent. This is quite often because they're actually historical fiction writers trying to pass themselves off as professional historians rather than people who went and got a PhD in history, which required them to write a 80 to 100,000 word thesis and get it past 2 expert examiners, and at worst they are total liars attempting to dupe people with their crazy stories to make a quick buck and get attention. Like Murray, they'll often botch their reading of the sources, ignore anything which doesn't support their predetermined conclusions, or when an inconvenient truth threatens their delusions/pack of lies, claim it's a conspiracy and that they are the only person who's smart enough and special enough to see the truth. I'll leave some of my videos linked below, which debunk a fantasy story about the princes in the tower, the false claim that Anne Boleyn was pregnant at the time of her death, and the idea that a picture, which is almost certainly of the dark-haired Catherine Howard, is actually Anne of Cleves, a woman described by an eyewitness as being blonde. So to sum up this part of the video, I think we can confidently rule out the idea that witchcraft had anything to do with William's death. I don't think there's any evidence from the near contemporary sources to suggest a murder plot hatched by Henry I either, or anyone else, though I admit Henry had a plausible motive and you can't absolutely prove that he didn't organise a plot, but if he did, it was kept remarkably well hushed up, and Tirel and his family, despite claims to the contrary, don't seem to have greatly benefited from it if he did in fact commit regicide. Having looked at the evidence, I think the most likely scenario is that William was accidentally killed, possibly but not definitely by Walter Tyrrell, Count of Poix. You can let me know what you think in the comments below though. For the final section of the video, let's look at what happened to William's body after death and at the mystery surrounding the location of his remains. The primary sources are unanimous here that he was taken to Winchester for burial, though the way in which he got there and the treatment his corpse received are up for debate. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives only the barest of details, saying he was brought to Winchester and buried in the cathedral. But William of Malmesbury elaborates, writing that a few countrymen conveyed the body, placed on a cart, to the cathedral at Winchester, the blood dripping from it all the way. Here it was committed to the ground within the tower, attended by many of the nobility, though lamented by few. This was hardly a very respectful way to deal with the body of the king, and Orderic Vitalis indicates that the corpse was poorly treated too, saying, "Some of the servants wrapped the king's bloody corpse in a mean covering, and brought it, like a wild boar pierced by the hunters, to the city of Winchester. The clergy, the monks and citizens, with the poor widows and mendicants, went in procession without delay to meet the body, from respect to the royal dignity, and buried it in the old minster of St. Peter. Notwithstanding, the doctors and prelates of the church, taking into consideration his debauched life and tragical end, did not hesitate to pass sentence upon him, and thought that as they had been unable to inflict salutary punishment upon him for his iniquities while he lived, he must be treated as a reprobate and one who did not merit absolution." So the body was taken in a very poor condition to the cathedral, and William's own clergy didn't think he merited absolution. Their beliefs were only hardened in this respect in 1107, when the church's tower fell down, and some thought that this was further divine retribution being enacted against the dead monarch for his sins. Malmesbury, though, called these ideas, quote, unsupported trifles, more especially as the building might have fallen through imperfect construction, even though he had never been buried there. Other sources, like the Chronicon ex Chronicus and Ralph de Decato, also affirm that the body was buried in Winchester, in the church of St. Peter in Chains. But what happened to it next? Well, the tomb evidently survived the 1107 calamity and remained in the church. However, there is some confusion now as to which grave is actually his. A description of it from 1592, written by John Stowe, indicates that William Rufus had been buried under a, quote, plain, flat marble stone before the lectern in the choir. But Stowe said that even by the time he was writing, the bones had long since been moved and placed in a mortuary chest with those of the Anglo-Saxon king Canute. These mortuary chests had been remodelled during the time of Richard Fox, who was Bishop of Winchester in the first quarter of the 16th century, and as best we can tell, this is the event Stowe is referring to when he says the bones were moved. There are 6 such chests in the church, 2 of which actually have inscriptions claiming they contain Rufus's bones. Stowe's description of a flat marble slab is also completely inconsistent with the tomb which was being identified as William's by 1635 and which you see here in an image from 1677. This tomb is consistent with the medieval period and was not created during the Tudor or Stuart eras, so we can rule out the idea that it was a new addition to the church. Instead, sometime in the 43 years between John Stowe's work and 1635, when a man named Lieutenant Hammond was told that the coffin tomb was William's, the beliefs around what was the final resting place of the so-called Red King had changed, or at least they were beginning to change. A report from 1642 indicates a continuing belief that the bones were in a mortuary chest. Nevertheless, the belief that this coffin-shaped tomb was William Rufus's evidently took hold, and it continued to be called his until the 20th century, when it was re-identified as that of his nephew, Bishop Henry of Blois, who died in 1171. It was opened in 1868, and if you're one of my historical figure or time traveller patrons, you'll be getting a bonus podcast this week telling you what was discovered at that point. I'll leave a link to my Patreon site in the description box for you if you'd like to take a look at it. What I will tell you here though is that the remains inside it were estimated to be a man of at least 5 feet 11 inches in height, which was tall for the medieval period, and this would seem to rule out William as he was described as being short. Furthermore, the grave goods found with him suggested a priest, not a king, lending further credence to the Bishop Henry of Blois theory. So where is Rufus then? Well, as best we can tell, after his initial tomb was damaged during the roof fall of 1107, he was reinterred under the plain flat marble stone before the lectern in the choir, described by Stowe, then moved into a mortuary chest with Canute in the early 16th century. The contents of those mortuary chests were rifled by Oliver Cromwell's supporters in December 1642 and used as missiles to break the church's windows, before eventually being put back in a jumbled up and damaged state. William Rufus's remains, if there is any of him left, are presumably distributed between these chests, as a list of their contents now displayed in the church suggests. So what do you think happened to William Rufus? Murder, accident, or witchcraft? And do you think Walter Tyrrell fired the arrow that killed the king? Let me know in the comments below, and to carry on the story of the Norman royal family, watch this video next about the death of Henry I's son in the infamous White Ship disaster. Then watch my videos on Henry's gruesome corpse and the life of his daughter Empress Matilda, who was almost the first Queen Regnant of England. I'll be back next time, and until then, as always, keep learning.